What if one of the most important ideas that helped save the American Revolution did not come from a famous general, a president, or a wealthy scientist, but from an enslaved African man whose name was almost erased from history? In the early 1700s, Boston was a city of narrow streets, wooden houses, church bells, crowded docks, and fear. Ships arrived from across the Atlantic, carrying sugar, rum, cloth, weapons, letters, and sometimes something far more terrifying: smallpox. To the people of colonial America, smallpox was not just a disease. It was a nightmare that moved from house to house like an invisible fire. It began with fever, pain, and exhaustion. Then came the rash, the blisters, the swelling, the scars. Families watched helplessly as children, parents, neighbors, and friends died within days. Those who survived were often marked for life. In some outbreaks, the living were so afraid of the sick that homes were shut.
At that time, most Europeans and colonists believed there was no reliable way to stop smallpox. Prayer, quarantine, and luck were often the only defenses. Doctors argued, ministers preached, and families waited in terror. But inside one Boston household lived a man who carried a different kind of knowledge brought across the ocean from Africa. His name was Onesimus. Onesimus was enslaved by Cotton Mather, one of the most powerful Puritan ministers in Boston. Mather was famous, educated, and deeply involved in the religious and intellectual life of the colony. But in his own house, the man he enslaved knew something that Boston's educated men did not fully understand. One day, Mather asked Onesimus if he had ever had smallpox. Onesimus answered that he had undergone a procedure in Africa that protected him from the disease. He explained that material from a smallpox sore had been deliberately introduced into the body, usually through a scratch in the skin. The person would become mildly ill, then recover, and afterward would be protected from the deadliest form of smallpox.
To modern ears, this sounds like an early form of vaccination, but this was decades before Edward Jenner developed the smallpox vaccine in England. What Onesimus described was called inoculation, or variolation. It was practiced in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Ottoman Empire long before it became accepted in Europe and America. To many people in Boston, however, the idea sounded dangerous, strange, even sinful. Why would anyone willingly put smallpox into a healthy person's body? Why would anyone invite the monster inside? Cotton Mather did not forget what Onesimus told him. He began collecting more reports and found that similar practices existed in other parts of the world. He became convinced that this African knowledge might save lives. But knowledge alone does not change history. It must survive disbelief, pride, fear, and ridicule.
Then, in 1721, smallpox returned to Boston. The outbreak began after a ship arrived in the harbor carrying infected passengers. Soon, the disease spread through the city. Panic grew. People fled if they could. The sick were isolated. Families prepared for death. Boston was trapped between the ocean and the disease. Mather saw the disaster unfolding and believed inoculation could help. He urged local physicians to try the method Onesimus had described. Most doctors refused. They considered it reckless. Some thought it would spread the disease faster. Others mocked Mather for listening to an enslaved African man instead of trained European physicians. But one doctor, Zabdiel Boylston, decided to take the risk. Boylston was not the most fashionable doctor in Boston, but he was brave enough to act. In June 1721, he inoculated his own son, his enslaved man, and the enslaved man's young child. Imagine the fear in that moment. There were no modern hospitals, no antibiotics, no clean laboratory equipment, and no guarantee that the procedure would work. If Boylston was wrong, he could kill the people he was trying to save.
If he was right, he might change the future of medicine in America. The reaction was explosive. Boston citizens were already frightened, and now they heard that a doctor was intentionally putting smallpox into people. Newspapers attacked the idea. Angry crowds threatened Boylston. Some people accused Mather and Boylston of playing God. The debate became so heated that Boylston had to hide. At one point, a bomb was thrown through Cotton Mather's window with a note warning him to stop. The bomb failed to explode, but the message was clear. People were willing to kill to prevent this new method from spreading. Yet as the outbreak continued, the numbers told a story that fear could not erase. Thousands of people in Boston caught smallpox naturally, and many died. Among those who were inoculated, far fewer died. The procedure was not perfectly safe, but compared to the full force of smallpox, it offered a much better chance of survival. Over time, the evidence became harder to deny. What had been dismissed as foreign, dangerous, and foolish began to look like one of the most powerful tools against one of history's deadliest diseases. But the most astonishing part of this story is not just that Onesimus knew about inoculation. It is that his knowledge traveled through a chain of events that reached far beyond Boston.
More than 50 years later, America was fighting for independence. George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, faced an enemy more deadly than British muskets. Smallpox was tearing through soldiers and civilians. Armies in the 18th century were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Crowded camps, poor sanitation, constant movement, hunger, exhaustion, and soldiers arriving from different regions with different levels of immunity. One infected recruit could start a disaster. Washington understood smallpox personally. As a young man, he had survived the disease while traveling in Barbados, and it left his face scarred. Because he had survived, he was immune, but many of his soldiers were not. The British Army had a major advantage because many of its troops came from places where smallpox was common, meaning they had already been exposed. The American Army, made up of men from rural colonies where smallpox was less common, was dangerously vulnerable. At first, inoculation was risky during wartime. A soldier who was inoculated needed time to recover, and during that period, he could spread the disease. If handled carelessly, inoculation could weaken an army at the worst possible moment. But Washington saw that doing nothing was even more dangerous. Smallpox could destroy his forces without a single battle. So, in 1777, he made a bold decision. The Continental Army would undergo mass inoculation.
It was one of the most important medical decisions in American military history. The process had to be kept organized, and in some cases, secret. New recruits were inoculated before joining active forces. Soldiers were isolated while recovering. The Army had to balance survival with military readiness. It was difficult, but it worked. Smallpox, which could have crippled the Revolution, became more manageable. Washington's decision did not win the war by itself, but it helped keep the Army alive long enough to fight. And behind that decision, behind the science, behind the controversy, behind the survival of soldiers who would help create the United States, there was a line of knowledge that led back to people like Onesimus. He did not receive medals. He did not sign the Declaration of Independence. He did not command troops. He was not invited into the halls of power. He was enslaved in a society that denied his freedom and often dismissed the intelligence of people like him. Yet the information he shared helped introduce a life-saving medical practice to colonial America. His story forces us to look at history differently. It reminds us that progress does not always arrive wearing a crown, a uniform, or a famous name. Sometimes it arrives in the memory of a person who was never supposed to be heard.
The tragedy is that we know very little about Onesimus's life beyond his connection to Cotton Mather and inoculation. Even his original African name is lost. Onesimus was a name given to him by Mather, taken from a figure in the Bible associated with slavery. Somewhere before Boston, he had a family, a language, a homeland, and a life that history did not preserve. He may have been taken from West Africa, where inoculation practices were known in some communities. He survived the Middle Passage, one of the most brutal human experiences in history. He was forced into bondage in New England, a place many Americans forget was also deeply connected to slavery. And still, despite everything stolen from him, he carried knowledge that saved lives. That is what makes this story so powerful. It is not only a medical story, it is a story about how truth can come from the people society refuses to respect. It is about how America's history was shaped not only by presidents and generals, but by enslaved people, indigenous people, immigrants, laborers, women, sailors, farmers, and forgotten witnesses whose ideas and actions changed the world without receiving the credit they deserved. In the 18th century, inoculation remained controversial, but it spread. Later, Edward Jenner's vaccine, developed in 1796 using cowpox, made protection against smallpox safer and more effective.
Today, when Americans think about the birth of their country, they often imagine battlefields, flags, muskets, and speeches about liberty. But hidden inside that same story is a quieter battlefield, the fight against disease. The Continental Army did not only need courage, it needed immunity. The revolution did not only depend on strategy, it depended on survival. And survival, in part, depended on a medical idea that Boston first learned through Onesimus. History is full of strange ironies, but few are as striking as this. A man denied freedom helped preserve the lives of men fighting for freedom. A man whose voice was nearly erased helped carry knowledge that protected a future nation. And a practice dismissed because it came from outside European tradition became one of the foundations of modern public health. So the next time someone tells the story of America as if it was built only by the famous names carved into monuments, remember the name Onesimus. Remember the crowded streets of Boston in 1721. Remember the fear of smallpox, the doctor forced into hiding, the bomb thrown through a minister's window, and the numbers that proved the truth. Remember George Washington ordering his army to be inoculated while the revolution hung in the balance. And remember that sometimes the knowledge that changes history comes from the person the world is trying hardest not to hear.
Thanks for listening to History. Must stay with me for next valuable historical video. Thank you.